Onto your headphones and pour your favorite beverage. It's time for the Kickin' or Stickin' Fantasy Football Podcast. Now, fresh off the sidelines, your host, Matt McPeak.
Fantasy freaks and geeks, what's up? Welcome to the Kickin' or Stickin' Fantasy Football Podcast, where I try to make your fantasy decisions just a little bit easier. This is the XFL Week 5 preview. Week 4 brought us the first 100 rushing yard performance. There was actually two of them, and they were both on the same team. Jacquizz Patrick, 108 yards. De'Veon Smith with 122 yards. There will be no winless team in the XFL as the Tampa Bay Vipers got their first win thanks to those two big running performances by their big-time running backs. We had a quarterback saying that they should bench one of their best receivers. We had a coach seemingly not know what the score was. And the best two teams after Week 3 are still the best two teams after Week 4, in my opinion at least. That is the undefeated Houston Roughnecks and the 3-1 St. Louis Battlehawks. On this episode, as always, we're going to check out the betting results from Week 4, look at the trends that are developing there. We'll check out all four of the XFL games. I'm 0-3 on my XFL parlays so far, but I'm going to keep it going. I got another one this week. We'll see if I can finally hit. And then I got a FanDuel lineup of some guys with good matchups that I think are gonna play well this week. So, Week 4, it was highlighted by the two home dogs winning. New York Guardians and the Tampa Bay Vipers both won. They were the underdogs at home. The New York Guardians were getting 7 points from the visiting Los Angeles Wildcats, and they won outright, 17-14. And thanks to their defense, they kept the score under 40. Total was 31. The other was Tampa Bay, who was getting only 1 point when the week started, but the line moved to 2.5 by kickoff. The Vipers had the widest margin of victory in Week 4, winning by 25 points. The game finished under 43.5, with the DC Defenders getting shut out. The only over to hit in Week 4 was Seattle and St. Louis. St. Louis was giving 12 points. It was the widest spread of the week. This week they also have the widest spread, which I think is also 12 points. Week 4, the over-under was set at 38.5, and the final score was 23-16 St. Louis. So they won the game but failed to cover, and they let the total go over. The biggest game of the weekend, though, end of the year so far, Houston at Dallas had an over-under of 50 points. Dallas was getting 1 point at home, but they lost by 7. This was Houston's first game of the year that it did not go over. So they've kind of been an over machine so far this year, and Week 4 that changed. So far, the home teams are 11-5. The under is 11-5. 5 home underdogs have won, plus 1 road dog in Week 1. St. Louis at Dallas, and Houston has covered in 3 of their 4 games. The road favorites are 5-0 against the spread. The home favorites are 3-2 against the spread. So, so far it seems like the home team, that's a safe bet. The under is a safe bet. Road favorites are 5-0 against the spread. So, if you are going to go with those road teams, seems like going with the favorites is the way to go. So that was Week 4. Definitely a good week. I was only able to see the Saturday game. Sunday had a lot going on, but it was a fun week. I'm excited about this league continuing. There's a lot of people who's talking about, week 1 was great, but then it's going to fall apart. And we've gotten 4 solid weeks so far this season. So let's look at the games here. So we have Seattle Dragons at the Houston Roughnecks Saturday at 2:00. The Dragons, the line opened with the Dragons getting 13 points, but I believe I saw this morning that it's now at 12. And the over-under is 45.5. Again, these are all FanDuel Sportsbook. That's what I use because it's the easiest. Houston's defense came to play in week 4, in the Texas showdown with the Renegades. They had 3 interceptions and 2 fumble recoveries. One early in the fourth quarter, which was returned for a touchdown, and one that was really an interception. DeMarcus Gates made a great fingertip catch when the ball kind of bounced off of Flynn Nagel's face mask, but because it was behind the line of scrimmage, it was technically considered a fumble. They held Dallas to their lowest total yards and the fewest first downs since week 1 when Landry Jones didn't play. Landry Jones had his lowest passing yards and his fewest completions so far this season versus Houston last week. So Houston's defense definitely came out to play. Houston's offense was not firing on all cylinders like they had been in the first 3 weeks. This was the first Houston game that did not go over, like I mentioned earlier. P.J. Walker had his lowest passing yards, lowest QB rating. He only had 2 touchdowns, which I know is kind of ridiculous to say, the guy only had 2 touchdowns, but considering he had 10 touchdowns in the first 3 games, it wasn't his best game. And he threw his first interception since week 1. James Butler only had 5 PPR fantasy points in week 4 after averaging 13 PPR fantasy points in the previous 3 games. And Nick Holley didn't get a single carry last week, but he led the team with catches with 8 and receiving yards with 97. Plus, he scored on a little 6-yard swing pass. Houston was looking great, even though they weren't playing at their best. Seattle, on the other hand, it wasn't great for them. They did get a shot in the arm, though, in the second half when head coach Jim Zorn decided it was time to put in B.J. Daniels at quarterback. He rushed the ball for 84 yards and really gave them a spark on offense with that zone read. He was on the field for both of Seattle's touchdowns. On 3rd and goal from the 1-yard line, they went to a 3 tight end set, and Kenneth Farrell punched it in for the touchdown. Daniels then kept it on his own read for a successful 1-point attempt after, but he didn't do enough in the passing game to get the win. He only completed 50% of his 10 passes. He had 100 yards passing, and he threw a touchdown, but 57 of those 100 yards came on his first throw, which was, again, a play-action deep pass to Alonzo Moore. Still not enough to match St. Louis. You got to come ready to play if you're going to play St. Louis. They were kind of bullying around Seattle last week, kind of like they did to New York the week before. If you're going to be playing these Battlehawks, wherever you're going to play them, you definitely got to come ready to play because you know they are. Embarrassing moment for Jim Zorn after the touchdown pass to Rodriguez in the fourth quarter. Zorn decided to go for a 3-point attempt down 4 points with 13 minutes to go. Now, obviously, looking back, that's not the right play in that situation. You go for 1 and you only need a field goal to tie, or you be aggressive and you go for 2 and a field goal on your next possession would win you the game, granted that your defense can hold. I get it. These new XFL rules may take some time to adjust to, but that was week 4. It's not week 1. We're going into week 5 here. These coaches have known the rules well before the season started. To me, there's no excuse for it. Even in an NFL game, if you're down 10 and you score a touchdown, you kick the extra point to make it a 17-20 game, and you play some defense, and you hope that your offense can then drive down and kick a field goal. Just very confusing decision by Jim Zorn. I think he got a little caught up in it, and I think these extra point after attempts are kind of throwing a loop at some of these coaches here. But like I said, there's no excuse for it. You got to know what the score is. You got to know the situation. There was still plenty of time in that game, especially with this new 2-minute rule. I don't get it. Also, Houston's defense, looking forward to this game here, Seattle at Houston. Houston's defense now has 8 interceptions this season. Seattle's quarterbacks have already thrown 5 in 4 games. So they better protect the quarterback. They better run the ball like they did in the second half at least. Looking at some of these stats that are in favor of Seattle, Houston has allowed the second most passing yards and the second most receiving yards to wide receivers. They've allowed the most receptions to wide receivers, but I don't think these things are really going to matter. All 5 of Seattle's wide receivers last week only caught 1 pass. Only 10 completions all game. One of them was by their wide receiver, Keenan Reynolds, who did play a little bit of quarterback when he was at Navy, so it's not like it's something he can't do, but they got to figure some stuff out here. All wide receivers besides Alonzo Moore had less than 10 receiving yards. I think with the QB change, we're going to see a lot more multiple tight end sets, a lot more heavy running with this trio of dragon running backs. Seattle wide receivers, they're going to get their opportunities on play action stuff. It's going to be deep passes, and, if they can't get that running game going, which means the play action is not going to sell, I think the Seattle wide receivers are going to be in for a long day. So I'm staying away from those Seattle wide receivers, even though the numbers say that they have a good matchup. Looking at Houston, they have some good matchups as well. Seattle has allowed the most yards to tight ends and the second most receptions to tight ends. However, Houston doesn't have a tight end on their roster. But what they do have is Nick Holley, who is now tied for second in targets among running backs, and Khalil Lewis, who is surprisingly leading the league in targets right now. We saw last week with Cam Phillips, not playing up to his standards, that Khalil Lewis got 13 targets, caught 6 of them for 53 yards. He did have one nice long catch of 20 yards. So he's playing great. Cam Phillips, as I mentioned, he got shut down by Dallas's Josh Hawkins. Phillips and Hawkins were locked into press coverage on 44 of 45 routes run in Week 4, and that's straight from the XFL website there. Phillips only caught 1 pass for 9 yards, so not his best game. Seattle has only allowed 1 rushing touchdown, so I think Houston is going to have to win in the air. That is definitely one of the strengths of Seattle, is that they have a pretty good run defense. So I think Houston's going to be looking to make some plays in the air, get Cam Phillips going again. All right, the next game we got here, we got the New York Guardians 2-2 versus the Dallas Renegades, who are also 2-2. The Guardians are getting 8 points on the road. The over-under is set at 37. New York got back on track with Luis Perez at QB, and with their running game, the team averaged 4.2 yards per carry. It was the 3rd highest of the week. Perez played just good enough to get the win. New York's only touchdown came on a Perez audible, actually, where he changed the play to a pass play, and he threw a perfect little back shoulder fade to Mikhail McKay. They could have put up more points, though. McHale dropped a wide-open pass where he had nothing but daylight in front of him. They had to settle for 2 field goals, one from the LA 3-yard line. Perez missed Jake Powell on a 1st and goal. Then on a 3rd and goal, they brought in Marquise Williams to run a little sprint out, which resulted in a sack. Then later in the game in the red zone, New York allowed 2 sacks, got pushed back to like the 29-yard line. And they had to kick it again. So if New York can stick with the run game in this matchup, I think they can put up more than 17 points. But credit to the New York defense holding Los Angeles to their lowest point total of the season with just 14. Dallas lost to Houston in Week 4 in a very sloppy game for them. They turned over the ball, like I said, 5 times, one in the red zone and in the 4th quarter, and one backed up in their own territory to lead to a Houston touchdown. Landry Jones had 3 interceptions and a 63% completion percentage. His lowest completion percentage, and actually the 4 lowest completion percentage among the 4 Renegade quarterback performances this season. But the real story for Dallas is that Landry Jones left with an injury. He left in the 4th quarter after re-aggravating the knee injury that forced him to miss pretty much the entire preseason and the first week. As of right now, it looks like he's going to miss 2 weeks, maybe more. Philip Nelson will start for Dallas here in Week 5. The home teams have won a lot of games here in the XFL, so being in Dallas will definitely help. New York has lost their 2 road games by a combined score of 56-9. So New York looks like they're not the greatest road team. So, but 8 points is a lot for a backup quarterback. Dallas is tied for the fewest receptions allowed to tight ends, and they're second in fewest receiving yards allowed to tight ends. New York tight ends have the second highest target share of all of the tight end groups in the league. Jake Powell has he's third in targets among tight ends with 14. So it's definitely something that the Guardians like to do, and it's definitely something that Dallas has proven that they're good at stopping. So that's going to be an interesting matchup to watch. Colby Pearson leads New York in targets and catches last week. He leads the team in targets, catches, and yards. Dallas is tied with DC for the most passing touchdowns allowed with 7. So Colby could be a value play in DFS this week. We'll see when I get to my FanDuel lineup if I'm going to go with him. On the Dallas side here, New York has allowed the most passing yards and the most receiving yards to wide receivers by almost 200. Dallas targets their wide receivers at the lowest rate in the league right now. But, maybe with the QB change, maybe that'll slightly change. Dallas targets their wide receivers the lowest, but Flynn Nagel has been pretty involved. 3 games in a row with 6 targets. He had a touchdown in week 3. So maybe we see him have another nice game here with this good matchup. All right, moving on to the Sunday game. Sunday at 3 o'clock, we got the 3-1 St. Louis Battlehawks going to the 2-2 DC Defenders coming off of 2 losses. DC is getting 3.5 points at home, and it's a 39-point over-under right now. The DC Defenders were embarrassed again last week by the winless Tampa Bay Vipers. 2 straight losses to winless teams in Week 3 and Week 4 for DC. They were only 2 for 10 on third down. Cardell Jones only completed 41% of his passes. The trio of Rodgers, Ross, and Tompkins caught only 7 of their 19 targets. Ugh. For a combined 43 yards, it's pretty bad. Cardell Jones was caught on camera actually saying that they should bench DeAndre Tompkins, saying that he's just not ready. The DC offense had fewer net yards than Jacquise Patrick did, who was second on his team in yards. So they were outgained by 2 different running backs. DC allowed over 250 rushing yards to Tampa Bay and is now second in the league in most rushing yards allowed. Not where you want to be with the St. Louis Battlehawks coming into town, who runs the ball more than any other team in the XFL so far. Going home again, this is another team going home after a loss. Should be good for them as they've outscored. They've scored 58 total points in their 2 home games compared to just 9 points that they scored in the 2 road games. Definitely another team that plays way better at home than on the road. St. Louis running backs Christian Michael and Matt Jones were not at their best. 47 rushing yards between the 2 of them on just 27 carries. But their third running back, Keith Ford, had a couple nice runs, and he scored on a pitch from Jordan Tiamu. On that same touchdown drive, Seattle's Marcel Frazier, who's made a bunch of really great defensive plays over the past few weeks, made a boo-boo. He roughed the kicker after Seattle forced a 4th down punt. Gave him a first down on that same drive on a 3rd and 8. DeMornay Personnel kind of had to dive and go to the ground to catch the ball, and none of the defenders touched him, so he just got up and kind of crawled over to the first down and picked up the first down. Not a good look. Just looks like no effort. After the touchdown, the Battlehawks ran some trickeration on the 2-point attempt on a end around, and then Tiamu pitched the ball to Pearsonell, who he could have just walked into the end zone, but he decided he wanted to be a star, and he wanted to throw for a 2-point conversion, and he missed a wide-open Marcus Lucas. It was not a good throw, and the attempt was obviously unsuccessful, so he got a chewing by his coach, said, come on, man, you Got to run that in. If you see daylight, you take it in. Tiama was the leading rusher on the Battlehawks in Week 4, though, with his 63 rushing yards. He had the most carries on the team with 16. And I think we're in store for another big rushing day for Jordan Tiamu. DC just allowed Taylor Cornelius to rush for 36 yards and a touchdown last week. And Tiamu, with his 186 rushing yards on the season, 5.1 yards per carry, is a hell of a lot more of a threat running the ball than Taylor Cornelius is. So DC is going to have to come ready to play in this game. Donald Pumphrey has the best matchup for all DC players. St. Louis has surrendered the second most receptions to running backs. Pumphrey is fourth among running backs right now in targets. He led DC in receiving yards last week, so not out of question for him to have another big game. The DC player that I'm definitely avoiding in this game is Eli Rogers. He's seventh in the league right now in targets, but his catch rate has went from 78% in week 1 and 2 to just 46% in week 3 and 4. St. Louis allows the second fewest passing yards and receiving yards to wide receivers. He's probably going to lead DC in targets like he did in weeks 1 and 4, but like I said, I'm staying away from him. I think this St. Louis defense is the best in the league, and I think they're going to continue to show it this week against DC, who's just been struggling the past 2 weeks to really do anything on offense. Interesting little tidbit here for St. Louis. Marcus Lucas is second in targets among tight ends, behind only Donnie Parham versus DC, who is allowing the third most receptions and receiving yards to tight ends. So Marcus Lucas could have a good game as well. He's got the matchup, and he's been very much involved. So, maybe we see him kind of emerge as one of the other tight ends, since it's pretty much just been Donald Parham and Nick Truesdale, who's missed the last 2 games. After a down week last week, the Seattle running backs are looking at a really juicy matchup. DC has allowed the second most rushing yards, and they're tied with Houston for the most rushing touchdowns allowed with 5. Like I said, these St. Louis running backs are definitely licking their chops for this matchup. All right, the last matchup of the week. Weird time, though. Sunday at 9 o'clock. Kind of weird. We got the Tampa Bay Vipers at the LA Wildcats. 2 teams are 1 and 3. It's a 40-point over-under right now. And Vipers are getting, I think it's 2 points now. They're getting 2 points on the road. The Wildcats are lucky to be going home for this game. The Vipers have to go out to Los Angeles, but it is a strange kickoff time, like I mentioned, 9 o'clock, so it's not like it's a super early game. They're coming off of the best rushing performance in the XFL so far, one of the best defensive performances too, really shutting out the DC defenders. Los Angeles made a few nice plays throughout the game, but for the most part, they also played a sloppy football game. They never really got off to a good start. They couldn't establish the run game. 3 different lead running backs in the last 3 games, and in the last two of them, they didn't even play. So they're struggling with their run game. They can't really find that one guy that they can count on. Last time I saw, Montez Carter is out for this game as well. But they need him back with his 5+ yards per touch and his 3 touchdown upside. Los Angeles' first 2 drives were 3 and outs. They went 2 for 12 on third down. LA's kicker Nick Novak missed 2 field goals. They didn't force any turnovers compared to the 5 turnovers they forced in week 3. Josh Johnson also threw that interception at the end of the third quarter inside the New York 38-yard line. The Wildcats, they really should have won that game. One thing for them, though, one out that they have is that this loss came with no Nelson Spruce. Spruce is 3rd in the league in targets, and he's only played 3 games, one of which was with Charlie Canoff at quarterback. So for this season, the only game we saw so far this season, the only game we saw with both Spruce and Trey McBride, quarterback Josh Johnson had a 148 QB rating, and the Wildcats put up 39 points, the most points they scored in a game so far. So if Nelson Spruce is back, then maybe that'll give them a little extra boost. Maybe that'll give them what they need to push them over the top. But if it's just going to be McBride again, then I think this Vipers defense is for real, man. And they say defense and running games, they travel. So if you're going to play daily fantasy this weekend, you're going to want to get one of these two Tampa Bay running backs in your lineup. The Los Angeles Wildcats have allowed the most rushing yards and the most receptions and receiving yards to running backs. So they pretty much they are the most generous to running backs. The Tampa Bay Vipers finally got their first win thanks to the running backs that they got, De'Veon Smith and Jacquees Patrick. They each averaged 5.1 yards per carry. De'Veon Smith with 3 more carries, and he also had 3 targets. But Jacquees Patrick got the touchdown. So Smith is now 5th among running backs in targets. He's very much involved in the passing game. Like I said, get one of these two guys in your lineup. Tampa Bay has the most rushing yards, and they're tied for first in yards per carry with 3.7. They're second in rushing attempts. The Tampa Bay running backs should eat this week. The Tampa Bay tight ends are also have one of the best matchups this week. LA has allowed the most receptions and the second most receiving yards to tight ends. So last week, no Nick Truesdale. He actually missed the past 2 games. But last week we saw Dan Goolsby catch all 3 of his targets for 41 yards, and he had a 13-yard touchdown. Tampa Bay has targeted their tight ends 20 times. It's the second most amount of targets to tight ends. Nick Truesdale, 5th in targets among tight ends, and he only played in the first 2 games. He was a full participant in practice on Wednesday, so he looks like he's in line to play this Sunday, but you never know. So if he's active, then he's going to be in my lineup for sure. Looking at De'Veon Smith, LA, like I said, they get killed by the running back, so I'm playing him. Looking at the Wildcats, McBride and Saheed Blacknell each caught a touchdown of over 40 yards. Jordan Smallwood made a few plays. He had both of the 2-point attempt targets. He caught one of them. But this week they see Tampa Bay's defense that has allowed the fewest passing yards and the fewest receptions to wide receivers. So I'm just I think I'm going to stay away from the LA guys unless Nelson Spruce is back, because that's really going to help them a lot. Another quick thing for these LA Wildcats, Brandon Barnes leads in receiving yards when lined up as a true tight end. So Donnie Parham's kind of getting all the attention as the top tight end in the league, but he runs the overwhelming majority of his routes as a slot receiver. He's only run a route as a inline tight end 9 times, so 4% of his routes, compared to Brandon Barnes, who's run 77 routes as an inline tight end. So Brandon Barnes, another one of these tight ends that maybe you want to pay down at tight end. You don't want to pay the $18 that it costs you on FanDuel to get Donald Parham in your lineup. All right, real quick, let's get to my 3-team parlay. Houston Roughnecks minus 12.5 at home versus the Seattle Dragons. It's a lot of points, but I think I'm going to go Houston minus 12. The home teams in the XFL have been dominant. 13 points is a lot, but Seattle has lost by 12 in 2 of their 3 losses. Houston averages 31 points per game. Seattle averages only 16 points per game. I think Houston's defense follows up their big 5-turnover performance last week with another big game in Week 5. I'm going to take the Seattle Battlehawks minus 4.5 at DC Defenders. The Defenders, especially their defense, looks like it has no interest in playing smash mouth football, which is what which is what St. Louis forces you to do. After seeing what Tampa Bay running backs were able to do last week, I think Matt Jones, Christine Michael, and Keith Ford are going to come to this game ready to rock. I don't think going home is going to be enough for the Defenders. I see another ugly loss for DC. And my third leg here is going to be Tampa Bay Vipers +2 at the Los Angeles Wildcats. Now, this could change if Nelson Spruce is active. If so, I think I'll take the Wildcats at home. But as of right now, I'm going to go with the Vipers. Or maybe just go with the Vipers money line, maybe get a little slightly better payout, because really, what's 2 points? Yes, it's an East Coast team going out west, but with Tampa coming off its first win, running the ball the way they did last week, and with the way that the LA run defense has played, plus LA's vulnerability to tight ends, and Tampa Bay looking like they're going to get Nick Truesdale back, I'm going to go against the trends, and I'm going to go with the road team here, traveling across the country. I think Tampa is better than their 1-3 record, and I think they bring that top-ranked defense out to LA and get themselves another win. All right, my FanDuel lineup for week 5. PJ Walker for $23, best quarterback in the league. He's at home, coming off of for him a bad game. Devion Smith for $16, 120 rushing yards last week. Best matchup for running backs in the XFL this week. If Nick Truesdale is active, I'm going to play him for $13. He should be very much involved. LA does not cover tight ends very well. Flynn Nagel for $16. New York has been smoked by number 1 wide receivers. Christine Michael for $14. I saved $2 by going with Michael instead of Matt Jones. I think they're both going to be very much involved, but the one thing Michael has over Jones is that he sees more targets. And lastly, we got Nick Holley for $17. 10 targets last week for Nick Holley. FanDuel actually changed his position from running back to wide receiver. He's 12th in the league right now in targets overall, 4th or 5th in the league in targets among running backs. So that's going to do it for the Week 5 XFL preview. Thank you for tuning in to the Kickin' or Stickin' Fantasy Football Podcast. I appreciate you listening. Make sure you check us out next week as we go over what is going to happen in Week 5 and what we'll expect to see in Week 6. And as always, may the fantasy gods be cruel to your opponents.
You have been listening to the Kickin' or Stickin' Fantasy Football Podcast. For more great episodes and information, follow us on social media and tune in every week. Kickin' or Stickin' is available on Google Podcasts, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Alexa, Reach.tv, or your favorite podcast service. Kickin' or Stickin' is a proud member of the HC Universal Network family of podcasts. To find out more about this and other great shows on our network, visit us online at hcuniversalnetwork.com today. Fantasy football is fun, but gambling addiction destroys lives. If you or someone you love suffers from gambling addiction, please do not be afraid to seek help. The National Council on Problem Gambling operates the National Problem Gambling Helpline Network. Contact them today at 1-800-522-4700. Thank you for tuning in to the Kickin' or Stickin' Fantasy Football Podcast. Please remember to play responsibly and always look for your man downfield.